So now that you've understood conceptually how Docker Compose works, it's now time to convert these Docker run instructions for two of these applications, one for the web server, the front-end web server, and the database, which is TIDB, into a Docker Compose spec. In order to start writing the Docker Compose spec, this is a good reference. If you just search for Docker Compose reference, you will land up on this page. And this talks about all the instructions and some examples of how to write this Docker Compose spec file. And on the right hand side, you have all the instructions and the specs and the properties that can go possibly into the Docker Compose file here. So let's go ahead and start converting this code into Docker Compose spec now. How do you do that? Is first, let me actually go and delete all the containers that I had created manually, namely the TIDB server, because I want to launch it automatically using Docker Compose spec now. And then I would create a file by name docker compose.yaml. And where do we create this file is in the same path as your application code. So in my case, my application code is in a specific path. Inside Docker Compose .NET album viewer, this is where I cloned my application, and this is where I would be creating the file at. So let me actually save the file as that. Here, yeah. So docker-compose .yaml is how I would save this file as. Let me just verify that it has created the YAML. It created a YAML.txt as usual. Now this feature of Windows sort of irritates me a lot, because even though I specified the extension, it didn't honor that. It still adds its own .txt. All right. Okay, so how do we write this spec? Is we have to add first the version of Docker Compose spec, that is, right? And based on that version, certain features would be available to you. Also, the version needs to have a specific version of Docker engine. Let's say if you want to use the 3.8 version of Docker Compose spec, you must have 1903 and above. And we are talking about the Docker version. So if I look at Docker version, let's find out what is our version. 19.038, which is fine. So we could use 3.8. And if you use 3.8, you can pretty much use everything which is available here. You typically see in the instructions which one has been created and which supports or compatible with which version of Docker Compose that is, right? So let's go back here, add the version as 3.8. And everything that you create, all the containers that you launch are typically part of the microservices that you launch. So it goes as part of services. So you create services, right? And inside the services, let's possibly look at some examples. So you have version, you have services, and inside the services, for every application, you would create a service with some specific name. This name is important because this is how you discover your database. I'll show you where it is actually useful. So I have two services here. Now indentation, this is YAML, so indentation is extremely important. You don't use tabs, don't use it either. Use two spaces and indentation typically. So let's say we have the application which is album viewer, and then the second, which I am just gonna call as DB. That's it. Now here we add the properties of this service. Let's say how we want to launch it. So Docker run instructions now is what we convert into the YAML spec. So everything including the name. Name is here. Name is what we have added, album viewer and DB instead of TIDB and app. And we add rest of the configuration. Let's say for the application server, we have to provide the image, the connection string, which is the environment variable, port mapping, And that's it. So image port mapping is defined as ports. You can define multiple ports or map multiple ports. So if it is multiple, you can typically use, or you will typically use, hyphens if it is an array. Even though we have one item in the array, that should be okay. Ports and environment. Let's say environment. Environment here is going to contain 2 environment variables. That's it. For database, it's going to be extremely simple. We have an image. You can define the ports if you want to. Not mandatory, because the only thing that is going to connect to the DB is the application here. Let me just add it because we did that earlier as well. So let's just fill in the details now. The image that I have created for the album viewer application is my image here. So whatever the name that you use, make sure it's the same name. Port mapping is 80 on the host connecting to 80 on the container. Okay. With v1 80:80. Environment variables are important, so you have to provide that entire string for environment variables. Let's say this is my first environment variable. In your lab guide, you are going to get details about these. The second is my data connection string, which has this value. So I would use this as is. All right, I have image appended at the end, which I'm going to remove. So that remains my connection string. Looks good. Now, the only thing that I'm going to change now here in this connection string, and this is going to make my life simpler because I never have to discover the IP address of the DB. I can point to the database using a name as DB. And if you use, let's say, if you use a different name here, I'm going to point to database using just name DB. And this is important because if you use a different service name, it is going to discover using the service name. So if you just call this as database instead of DB, this string need to change accordingly. That's it. So that's good enough. So this is how I want to launch this service called as album viewer, using an image that I have built, defining the ports, the port mapping, environment variables. That's it. For the TIDB, it's gonna be extremely simple. We just used an image, which was this one, Docker samples, TIDB nano server with the same tag. And the port mapping is gonna be 3306, pointing to 4000. Again, this is not even needed. I'll tell you why. In fact, if I remove this, it makes it much better and clearer because you don't have to expose this database to outside your host basically. The application needs to connect to it and that's it. So you don't have to expose it unnecessarily if it does not need to. And that's what I'm going to do. That's good from the security perspective. Right, so that's it. So that's my Docker Compose file. So in this lesson, you've learned how to write a Docker Compose file and convert your instructions, Docker run instructions, into a Compose spec. In the next one, I'll demonstrate how to use the Docker Compose commands to read this file and build that infrastructure.